Okay, we are going to start. So, welcome again, everybody. For those of you that weren't here last night, that was very unfortunate. You missed an outstanding plenary session with Lupe Gonzalo, who's now there. Stand up for just a second so we can recognize you again. Yeah. And a good follow-up discussion by Patrick Mason. But we have a great panel and set of sessions coming up today and tomorrow. We have really fortunate to have such great collection of speakers. And welcome to everybody online as well as locally. And I again, first of all, want to acknowledge the people that are really making it happen, and that is Nicole Dunham. Where is Nicole Dunham? In absentia, Nicole Dunham and Kim Weinstein. And also, we really, it's important that we have the discussion here be spread as widely as possible, and that's why we have this super high-tech operation going. And I want to acknowledge the people that are the super high-tech people making it happen. So that's Dan Mattson and the other Dan Winkler. So Dan Winkler from Really Useful Media and Dan Mattson from Comingo Number One. Is that how you say it, Dan? Huh? Oh, Communicate Number One. Okay. Well, anyway, thank you both for your work. And I also want to briefly introduce the co-director of PERI. At dinner last night, somebody asked me, how long has PERI been around? I said, 25 years. And they said, what's your big anniversary event? I said, hadn't thought of that. Well, this is it. Welcome to the 25th anniversary event of PERI. So it just happened to work out. Anyway, so I want to introduce the co-director of PERI, Jerry Epstein.
Thank you, Bob. I just want to welcome everybody, and welcome to the, I can't think of a better 25th anniversary celebration than this conference last night. It was absolutely inspiring last night. Lupe and Patrick and Marley did just a fantastic job of translating. Thank you, Marley, for that. I'm so looking forward to today, elaborations on what was said last night and other aspects of the struggle that we're all in. So without further ado, I want to introduce Patrick Mason, who's going to chair this session.
So we are using the handheld mic so that people online can hear clearly, if you don't mind. And does it say that?
Yeah, you don't have to use it.
If you talk into that all the time, don't worry. But since a lot of us, like me, wander around, I guess it's good to use the handheld mic. Okay, so without further ado, here's our moderator for this morning, Patrick Mason.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we have a fantastic panel assembled here this morning. So got name tags, and Greg Asbed from Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And on our list here, Thea Lee is down at the end. And then in the It's a Small World department, Thea and I were at the University of Michigan around the same time. Yeah, a couple of years ago. And that was before I went to the New School for Social Research in New York. Maggie Gray, they're from Adelphi University, and Jen Sherer from Economic Policy Institute. So let me see, in terms of the order presentation, I guess, so we'll go Maggie, then Jen, then Thea, then Greg will be last. All right, so 20 minutes each.
Okay. So, I guess the question is, I'm speaking or not. Okay. Does it sound like I'm speaking into the mic for everybody? Okay, great. So, first of all, I just want to say how honored I am to be here today and to thank Bob and Patrick for the invitation. And I also want to recognize the labor of Nicole and Kim in putting this all together and the folks doing the media in the back. Thank you. Okay, so before I get started on my presentation, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. I've been doing field work with New York farm workers and their organizations for 23 years. This is my book, Labor and the Locavore, and my most recent publication is a report. I don't know if you can see very well, but that's the logo at the bottom for the UMass Labor Center. So I was really pleased to be able to publish this report through UMass. And I did the research, did the work on this report with 2 graduate students at the Labor Center. It's based on 530 surveys with farm workers from across New York State. And this data was given to us by Trabajadores Agrícolas Unidos, which is a coalition of unions organizing farm workers. And I just want to start there because I think this is an example of activist research working directly with organizations. Okay, so I won't be discussing farm worker conditions today, but I'm guessing that this quote from a New York dairy worker resonates with everyone in this room who might have the privilege to know and serve low-wage workers in a different way. I also wanted to give you some context about New York farm workers and agriculture. So the vast majority of New York's 50 to 80,000 farm workers are undocumented Latinos. We also have somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10,000 foreign H-2A guest workers who are also mostly Latinx. New York has a lot of small farms. 71% of our farms are between 10 and 179 acres. The average farm size is 207 acres. So when most out-of-staters think about New York, you might think about the Big Apple, New York City, and not necessarily the apple farms. But New York has a surprisingly robust agricultural sector. So let me give you some of our national rankings. We are ranked first in cottage cheese and yogurt production, second for sour cream, maple syrup, cabbage, apples, and snap beans, third for Italian cheese, grapes, squash, calves, and wine, and ranked fourth for corn silage and milk production. Okay, so just with some of that context in mind, what I want to discuss today, I have 2 goals. First, I'm going to give you some background on federal and state policies that affect farm workers, and a New York organizing update. And then I'd like to reflect on what it means, at least to me, to be an activist scholar. All right, so for those of you who are not aware, farm workers were excluded from New Deal labor legislation, right? So these really labor-friendly policies that contributed to the growth of the middle class and the accumulation of wealth, farm workers and domestic workers were left out of these protections. These really racist underpinnings to this decision because Southern senators had a strong hold on the U.S. Senate at the time. In 1963, we see the first effort to try to address farm worker vulnerability. Patrick yesterday talked a bit about the exploitation from labor contractors. But the 1963 law and the ensuing 1974 amendment did very little. to address farm worker exploitation. The 1960s saw growing awareness about the conditions of U.S. farm workers, and it's within that context that Congress passes 2 more laws and also ended the Bracero program, the very exploitive guest worker program on the West Coast for human rights abuses. What's interesting and what many people don't know is that there was a corresponding guest worker program on the East Coast called the British West Indies program that was never terminated. And so the difference, of course, is Cesar Chavez and the farm worker activism and organizing that was taking place in California. But the British West Indies program then serves to become later the H-2A guest worker program that we have today. So, 1966, farm workers are included in the federal minimum wage, except for those on the smallest farms, roughly those fewer than 7 workers. So what's really interesting is that Patrick noted yesterday that the 1970 wages in Florida didn't always match the federal minimum wage because farm workers were excluded from the minimum wage. But in fact, Patrick, if you were in a crew of 7 or more, you should have been receiving at least the federal minimum wage, okay? And this is a trend we see, right? Laws are only as good as their enforcement, and when workers themselves are unaware of the law and they're vulnerable, this is something that their employers take advantage of. 1983, with the passage of the APA, this then is rather significant changes for seasonal and migrant workers. Important to note that year-round workers are excluded from APA, which today we are much more aware of. Year-round agricultural jobs tended to be filled by locals, right? But today they're largely filled by the same population that fills the seasonal jobs, and there are really significant challenges in particular for dairy workers and other year-round workers. Okay. New York. The 1937 New York labor laws followed the federal precedent and exclude farm workers as most other states do. And there's little policy change until the 1990s. Okay, so what's happening in the 1990s? There's an advocacy coalition that starts. This will later become the Justice for Farm Workers. So you see 3 changes to the law. Clean drinking water for every farm worker, sanitation and hand washing facilities for every farm worker. Previously, this only applied if there were 5 or more workers. And then New York includes farm workers in the state minimum wage. There's no change then for 20 years. Why is that? So farm worker advocates decided they no longer wanted to accept a piecemeal approach to changing the labor law. They wanted farm workers included in all of the labor laws. So year after year, we went to Albany. Year after year, there was public education. And it's this lawsuit in 2019. Okay, Crispin Hernandez is a Guatemalan dairy worker who's fired from his job for organizing. And then he becomes brave enough to become the plaintiff in a lawsuit. And the New York courts find that the exclusion of farm workers from collective bargaining protections violate the New York State Constitution. This decision is significant, not just on its own grounds, but it's announced in May. The New York legislative session ends in June, typically. And this decision brings the reluctant farm industry to the table to negotiate. Why? They don't want workers to have the right to strike. So you see a compromise with the FLIPA. All right, so farm workers get card check, which, you know, the promise of card check is complicated, but they have a card check system. They don't have the right to strike. The extensive bill passes because you have a Democratic majority in the New York Senate for the first real majority in 80 years, okay? The Democrats had control briefly in 1965 and 2009. Today, the Democrats hold a supermajority in the New York State Senate. The New York State Assembly has long been Democrat-dominated. So starting in 2020, farm workers would have the card check process for unionization, and the PERB, a state agency, would oversee that process. I want you to keep the name of that agency, the PERB, in mind. We're going to come back to that. So I also want to point out that this is a really different approach than what we see with the Fair Food Program, which we might consider a more of a market model. Now, I'm not here to discuss the merits, but to just say part of this comes from the context, these different strategies. So I remember talking to Greg, my co-panelist and co-founder of the CIW, probably back in 2014, and we were discussing the differences between Florida and New York, and Greg was talking about just the impossibility of getting anywhere in Florida with legislative change. And Greg, I think you said something to me at the time like, New York is such a progressive, labor-friendly state. They could pass a farm worker law. They should pass a farm worker law, right? Like, keep going here. And again, this would have been, the FLIPA would have been an impossibility in the Sunshine State. Okay, so more success for farm worker policy in last year. The labor commissioner announces that the overtime threshold will be reduced from the 60 hours set by FLIPA. Remember, before that, there is no overtime threshold. It will be reduced from 60 hours to 40 hours over the course of 10 years. In addition, farmers will be able to get reimbursed for that additional overtime. Okay, they have a 118% tax credit for that overtime premium, the half and time and a half. This is to account for the deductions for Social Security, disability, etc. What does this mean? It means that even though the threshold is going from 60 hours to 40 hours, farmers should have zero increase in what they're paying in terms of overtime. They can get reimbursed by the state. Okay, we can talk about that another time. But let's keep going. So what has this led to? We've seen organizing successes. We've got the United Farm Workers, and we've got TAO organizing in the fields. This is really difficult work. Okay, so United Farm Workers represents 5 apple farms, and Trabajadores Agrícolas Unidos, which is a coalition of the UFCW, the RWDSU, and 3 locals. They represent 6 farms, and to date, they have 2 contracts ratified. Exciting, right? All right. The farm industry fights back. There have been 2 cases this year. Now, 20 years ago, I think we could have looked at these court cases as frivolous cases. These are going to go away. But as well you know, the U.S. Supreme Court decisions, the Janus decision, a more recent decision that restricts access to workers on farms, who access to go onto the farm, demonstrates that the federal courts at least are moving in a different direction. The April case actually challenges whether or not H-2A workers can be included in collective bargaining protections. That case has been absorbed into a federal case that motion was put out just this past month. The case in particular takes aim at the collective bargaining protections of the FLIPA. It's to be heard by a Trump-appointed federal judge in Buffalo, okay? So again, 20 years ago, a different political context, but today, advocates are pretty nervous. You know, where is this headed? What does this mean? Could this end up at the Supreme Court? And then what? Okay, so to sum up, farm workers have seen considerable policy change in an effort to mitigate their exploitation, yet some of that success now hinges on the courts. And in the meantime, the unions can't get their units certified. The PERB has voluntarily decided to stop certifying bargaining units and to stop processing unfair labor practices. I believe that the PERB is trying to do the right thing by voluntarily doing this. They didn't have to get involved in the negotiations, and then we can get to the case sooner. But, you know, certainly this is having an effect on the organizing campaigns. Thank you. Okay, so, oh, sorry. I was thanking Patrick. Thank you for the 5-minute warning. Okay. All right, so it was a little abrupt there. So, okay. So let me shift a little bit to my experience with activist scholarship. I hope this can resonate with others in the room. There are other academics. Maybe you share these experiences. Maybe you want to tell me about different experiences. Any students might offer some insight for pursuing this path. And worker organizations, you've been on the other side of the relationship with academics. Skip over a slide here. So this is a quote that comes from an article on civically engaged research, which is what the more formal political science term is. So whether you call it action-oriented, activist, or civically engaged, we might have different relationships with the target community, okay? But for me, when I was reflecting on what it means to be an activist scholar, I kept coming back to the idea of mutually beneficial. And I tried to brainstorm about what have I offered workers and worker organizations, and how has my own professional journey benefited? Since 2000, I've done activist scholarship. Okay, you heard me say we when I talked about the Justice for Farm Workers campaign. My mentor is Frances Fox Piven, whose work, of course, is a model of activist scholarship. I've consulted and volunteered with 6 farm worker advocacy organizations in the state. I like to believe I've played some small role in some of the policy changes that have taken place. And I just want to share with you that for the past 3 years, I've been working closely with Trabajadores Agrícolas Unidos. This has been the most meaningful 3 years of my academic career. I had no idea that my 2 decades of expertise would be so useful to the union organizing campaign. I've learned a ton in the process, but it's been such a gratifying experience to be able to contribute to this work. All right, so what might it look like? What does activist scholarship look like? Okay, especially for any graduate students. If you want to be an activist scholar, I have 2 words for you. Folding chairs. I cannot tell you how many folding chairs I have opened and closed for different events over the years. Okay, so in addition to offering some sort of expertise, you need to help, right? If you're working for low-wage workers or serving organizations that cater to low-wage workers, they're under-resourced, okay? So find a room, take out the garbage, take initiative. Don't ask how you can help. That's actually putting a burden on the organization. Just figure out how to help, okay? Just do it. Okay, so volunteering, yep, public education. So I've done a lot of public scholarship, whether that's op-eds, giving free talks at various places, journalism, reports, expert testimony, consulted on amicus briefs, put my name on amicus briefs. Happy to talk about that more. What are some of the guiding questions that you have to ask yourself? So when you're involved in really various field work, you have to remind yourself, what is your goal, right? And your goal here is to support and empower the workers, including through their organizations. And you have to be willing to make sacrifices, right? When Tao gave us those 530 surveys and said, would you write a report? I had to put aside some articles I'm working on, okay? So some of those sacrifices might mean that your professional trajectory might take a little bit longer. Okay, I don't have a lot of time to talk about some of the challenges, but just a couple of shout outs. There are hierarchies that you really need to be aware of. You're not going to change those hierarchies, but being aware that your professional expertise, possibly your class, race, citizen status, and other demographics, this is something you have to keep in mind. Does putting out and closing folding chairs look like it's beneath you to the population that you're serving? And then happy to address some more of the challenges. Just one that I might point out is boundaries, okay? There are unknown boundaries when you're working so closely, and you just have to constantly remind yourself to try to be aware of not overstepping that unknown boundary. And sometimes you don't know it until you put your toe over it a little bit. Okay, but at any rate, I just want to thank everybody, and I also appreciate the opportunity to really give some deeper thought into what it's mean for me over the years to be an activist scholar. So I look forward to chatting with you more about this.
Good morning. So I want to echo the thank yous to Patrick and Bob and all of the hosts and planners, and thank Maggie for beautifully setting up what I have to share this morning. So I want to start by saying hello from all of my colleagues at Economic Policy Institute. Many of you know some of them. For those of you who don't know EPI, I'm going to say epi.org because anything I say is said more extensively and better on our website. We do think of ourselves and have thought of ourselves for quite some time as labor's think tank. EPI was founded in 1986, is a nonprofit think tank created explicitly to include the needs of low and middle income workers in economic policy discussion. What I'm going to talk about this morning is some conscious shifting and expansion of EPI's focus on research policy and organizing partnerships, and the role of state and local or policy researchers in working directly with labor unions, worker centers, workers who are organizing on the ground, and a shift of some of our attention in a more dedicated way to the ways in which state and local policies are shaping worker power. So I have only been at EPI for about 2.5 years, and I came to EPI to join our state policy team. We have, for more than 20 years, in some cases very quietly, supported a network of about 60 state and local policy groups in 45 states around the country. That's a little glimpse here, and if you're curious about digging further into what those groups are, that map is live and clickable on our EARN Network website. What I'm going to talk about is the work that we've been doing to support some of those groups in expanding, in some cases, what have been long-standing relationships with labor unions and worker centers on the ground, and in some cases, initiating new relationships. I really appreciated last night's presentations, which reminded us of the importance of state policy, and Maggie beautifully expanded upon the degree to which so much of what workers, the terrain in which they're operating is constrained or in some cases expanded by state and local policies. So our Worker Power Project has sort of 3 core goals, primarily, ultimately expanding the ability of working people to collectively achieve racial, gender, and economic justice. And our theory of the case, for many, many data-driven reasons at EPI, is that organizing and collective bargaining are the ways that workers have most successfully been able to do that historically. And I just want to pause on this second note. So specifically, my role has been to help earn groups, our state and local groups, build their capacity to contribute directly to building worker power at the state and local levels. This is required, and I want to pick up right where Maggie left off. In some cases, doing lots of work with our state and local policy analysts and researchers on thinking about their roles. In some cases, especially our newer, younger folks who may have thought that they were coming to a policy group to sit in an office and work on a computer, which they still need to do. But their roles in engaging directly with the groups on the ground who are building the power necessary to win the changes that they know they want to see. So I'm also going to very briefly invoke a Philip Randolph this morning. Since I wasn't thinking about this before I came, but of course also a Floridian who got his start thinking about worker exploitation in Jacksonville and Crescent City. This is also a quotation that we often invoke in one of the central programs of our Earn Worker Power project, which is a series of Unions 101 workshops that we have done now dozens of times for our nonprofit partners, for our state and local earn groups. In some ways, sort of expanding their sense of what it means for workers to find a way to a bargaining table and how important that is in achieving the economic justice goals that all of them are committed to, but may not yet be familiar with the mechanisms that workers often, and the many hurdles workers face in finding their way to a bargaining table, including, of course, states like Florida, where for farm workers, for at this point in time, public sector workers and many others, there is no legal pathway to getting to a real bargaining table. So I'm not going to share a lot of charts today, but we have a lot of charts on the EPI website. So there's more where this came from. But of course, the central to our theory of the case is that the root problem of inequality in our economy is linked to, is caused by unequal power in our political system, our economic system, and in people's individual workplaces. We know that historically, when unions are stronger, there's less inequality. When workers can bring their collective power to bear at a bargaining table, whatever version of bargaining table they're able to find. And again, I appreciated last night in a very thought-provoking way, reminding us that that can look very different for different groups of workers at different times and places. That workers are then able to set wage standards in some cases for themselves, but also more broadly for entire industries and occupations. We are, beholding a new generation of folks getting to learn that both firsthand and from lots of news about major UPS or UAW contract settlement this year. And where that will go next, of course, is an exciting question. And of course, we also know that this union density historically is highly uneven. It's becoming increasingly uneven geographically across our country. The unevenness of union density, or which we sometimes sort of use as a proxy for worker power, state by state, means we also have very high variability in wage rates for low-wage workers, certain occupations across state. So one core piece of our Unions 101 program is helping folks understand that unions have a positive impact far beyond workplaces where workers are able to bargain contracts, and then to think about the ways in which their research and policy work can be joined with active struggles underway among workers in their state. Because no matter where they are, and no matter how low union density may be, there are workers who are working to improve their conditions. So, I think this is missing the caption, so I'll read it to you. This is my slide just to remind myself and all of you of the importance of state policy in shaping wage outcomes for low-wage workers. And this is just one example, thinking about the care work sector. We know care work is undervalued across the country, but also that wages and policies vary widely across state lines. So depending on where someone lives, they may be in exactly the same occupation, in some cases working for exactly the same, larger corporate entity, and their wages very different because of policy. We could begin to see that this is also true in other occupations like construction, farm work, to some extent fast food, as we're beginning to see some important standard setting happen in a couple of across. And of course, EPI has a very long-standing and ongoing commitment to support groups that have been engaged in campaigns to raise the minimum wage, raise the wage floor. Although often those campaigns have been very, very focused on state legislative lobbying and less focused on joining forces with groups of low-wage workers who are continuing to organize around other demands. So part of what we've also been doing is working on helping folks build on the momentum of the success of minimum wage campaigns around the country. So some of the key state worker power levers that we have been seeing many of our groups very effectively latch on to deeper intervention with include, of course, core labor rights of excluded workers, places where states have very broad latitude to act, or in most cases, not act, setting the framework for unionization and collective bargaining of workers who have been excluded from federal law. Maggie did a brilliant job of setting up and reminding us of how that's true for farm workers. It's also true, of course, for domestic workers, and still today for public sector workers. Right to work laws, which I won't have time to delve into deeply today, but of course that's the ability of states to constrain the collective bargaining rights of private sector workers, who, even though they are covered under federal law, after the 1947 amendment to our federal labor law, states have been given latitude to step in and constrain the bargaining relationship if they want to deliberately in order to weaken workers' rights. And then, of course, all the various labor standards, including minimum wage, that states have the ability to raise above the floor that may be set by the federal level, and in some cases set new standards that are not covered by federal law. So I'm going to share just a couple maps to give the snapshot, and this is really, it's sort of, imagine the complicated and important story that Maggie told about state law covering farm workers times 50. Each state has a different history of whether it covers or does not cover unionization and collective bargaining rights of farm workers. And this is the public sector union rights map. This is a very simplified version of it, in which came up with 3 categories. One could make this much more complicated by looking at different dimensions of which states allow or require which level of employer bargaining with public employees. And the only other thing I want to say about the public sector for the moment, although we have continued to really encourage our state groups to think about this as a huge priority area for a number of reasons, but one of them is that it continues to be, especially in states with very weak or no frameworks for collective bargaining for public employees, a low-wage sector for many workers, especially in the occupations where women and workers of color are more likely to work. And in 13 states, over 20% of state and local government workers are less than $50 an hour. And particularly, we're talking about the occupations such as direct care, child care, building and grounds maintenance, and teaching assistants or education support professionals. Continues to be a very low-wage occupation, very important occupation. And so the focus on the public sector and whether workers have the ability to get to a bargaining table has been one of our core priorities in the project. Just as a reminder, the other reason this is an incredibly important priority in our project is that public sector employee rights that had been in place, many states have been eroded in the past decade. This is one map just illustrating the wave of attacks. Most of us are familiar, at least, with the Scott Walker very dramatic repeal of what had been a long-standing collective bargaining framework in place in Wisconsin, but that spread very quickly to multiple states and continued to this day to have significantly eroded rights that were in place in multiple states. We're also at a point in time, just particularly the last 3 to 4 years, where several states are moving the other direction. So there's a lot of opportunity to begin both rectifying some of the damage that was done by those attacks a decade ago and to build rights out where they haven't existed in states. Same is true in the right to work map. And I share this one very quickly, just mostly so people can sort of mentally latch onto the geography of where some of these attacks have been happening. The red states that are on this map are states that have had right to work laws in place for decades. The orange ones are states that added a right to work law after just since 2010. Michigan, of course, is the first and only of those orange states that this year repealed and took the right to work law off the books due to a change in the makeup of their state legislature. So the prospect for doing that is also on the table in some other states, and some interesting discussions bubbling up even in places like Virginia, Arizona, about whether these laws are becoming increasingly unpopular. So transition, and what I want to wrap up with is just giving you a couple little glimpses of the ways in which what we've tried to focus on in the Earn Worker Power Project is allowing people to think about how to bring the tools of economic research, the assets of Economic Policy Institute, and our many, many Earn groups to bear in supporting active organizing and policy. So this is, again, the teaser reminder of the many, many tools that folks often use, both in their collective bargaining and their local campaign that live on the EPI website. We also, decades, have made an entire state data library available to our Earn groups that they've often used in their legislative lobbying. I want to share a couple of specific examples of the ways that our state groups have jumped into and expanded on this work in partnership. One of our groups, Every Texan, in the very large state of Texas, has been doing several projects on expanding collective bargaining rights. One thing they've been working on for 2 years now is a partnership with AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, and what they've done is taken data both that the union themselves had gained from surveying their own members and data from us. They took as a overarching model some findings that some of our researchers had generated on teacher and school staff nationally, and they localized using the same methodology, measuring what the trends had been. They worked jointly with AFT to then produce a report called The Lost Decade, see up here. And as part of a year-long campaign that AFT was leading that they called their Respect campaign, they localized the data even further down to the school district level and had union members, and this was a campaign focused not only on teacher pay, but on support staff across the district, including in many of those lower wage occupations, to show decision makers there is no bargaining table formally for teachers in Texas. There is no public sector collective bargaining framework yet at the state level. What they were trying to do was get district level leaders in the budgeting process to essentially come to a discussion with them about how wages were going to get set. And they were very successful in a handful of districts, including some where they won 10% or greater wage increases in some of those low-end classifications through this campaign. So and they are plugging away now in Texas in coalition both with AFT and CWA, communication workers who have for a long time represented units of state government employees, on moving the same sort of arguments into the state legislative budget process. Our group in Virginia has likewise been working very closely with a long list of different public sector unions who are doing the very exciting but also challenging work of implementing a breakthrough change in Virginia's state law, where for decades Virginia had outright prohibited any public government entity from collectively bargaining with its employees. A couple years ago, the state took a baby step and lifted the ban, the prohibition, on local governments from bargaining, did not put a framework in place, and instead said, if you want to begin collectively bargaining with your employees, you may do so, but you have to pass your own ordinance. So they sort of handed the ball to local governments to do this on their own. And our Virginia group, the Commonwealth Institute, has done a just phenomenal job of, again, taking what had been an EPI-generated model for measuring public sector pay gaps, so what are comparable employees making in the labor market, and showing how out of proportion and underpaid and undervalued much of the work of local government employees was. And they have done everything, I think, on Maggie's list, from testimony to assisting with drafting policy ordinances, to showing up at rallies, to setting up folding chairs, to assist unions in moving those local policies. And multiple counties and cities are now at the point of getting to the bargaining table with their employees for the first time. Big breakthrough. New York City, our group there has worked very closely with delivery service workers who have won a really important pay standard, made lots of national news recently, so hopefully folks have a little familiarity with that. And last but not least, I want to end with a mention of our group in Maine that has really been working on a multifaceted, multi-union set of partnerships, and become the convener for what unions in the state are calling their Economic Justice Coalition. You can see on the left a list of just a few of the state legislative gains they've been able to achieve as part of that coalition effort. And I want to note that a big piece of their future focus, which they've already decided to maintain, is on expansion of farm worker rights. They've had bills successfully passed, get vetoed multiple times, and so continuing that push into the next session, both for extending minimum wage and overtime coverage, but also collective bargaining rights, is a big part of it. Lots of questions and lots of additional discussion that I'm looking forward to diving into with folks. So I will stop and look forward to folks' thoughts and questions.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was great. It's still exciting for me to see all the great work of the Economic Policy Institute, where it's been sort of my intellectual home for more than 30 years. I started there as a trade economist in the early 1990s, went over to the AFL-CIO for about 20 years, came back to EPI for 3 years, left just as Jen was getting there, and Kyle, but always really value that kind of work. So good morning, everybody. I'm Thea Lee. So my current job, I'm at the U.S. Department of Labor. I head up the International Labor Affairs Bureau, which is basically the global wing of the U.S. Department of Labor. And I'm really happy to be here today. So many thanks to Bob and Patrick for inviting me, but also the great team at PERI, but also this amazing panel. It's really an honor to be here with all of you, and also the folks in the audience, some old friends. You know who you are. What I thought I'd do today, so I'm going to talk more about the international world, but hopefully tie it together a little bit, some of the same themes. So the title of today's panel, the Organizing, Policy Setting, and Action-Focused Research, I want to talk about each piece of those and how they connect, particularly in the current work that I'm doing at ILAB, the International Labor Affairs Bureau. So if you start out with organizing, how do you change policy to facilitate organizing? What are the levers of power? What changes the way governments and companies behave? What kinds of research will be instrumental in achieving policy change? And that's been a big part of my world, both at EPI, also at the AFL-CIO, and certainly now at ILAB. We have a team of economic researchers, but we're also expanding out and working with outside academics and researchers to bolster and support the kinds of arguments and the work that we're doing right now. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So, yeah, my career started in research. As Patrick said, I studied economics at the University of Michigan, but I kind of hated the academic world, was not suited for it. But I ended up in Washington, D.C. in the early 1990s working at EPI on trade policy. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the trajectory of my career because I think it's relevant to this conversation today, is that when I was there, and Jim Stanford is here from Canada and Australia, but in the early 1990s, we were there making the argument in Washington that labor standards, labor rights should be included in trade agreements and they should be enforceable, just like all the intellectual property rights or financial services or market access pieces of trade agreements. And we were treated like a bunch of nutcakes, like a bunch of radical nutballs. This was maybe the stupidest thing that anybody had ever heard of, and that maybe we were a little bit mentally defective or, in the pocket of big labor, like, that isn't what trade policy is about, little girl. Maybe you flunked Econ 101, that trade policy is about what we say it's about. It's about, but NAFTA was really interesting because it was the first time the United States had put together what you might call the Christmas tree of trade agreements. That it wasn't just saying, hey, you take your tariffs down and we'll take our tariffs down, let's be friends. It was also saying, here's 1,000 pages of things we want you to do in order to get access to the U.S. market. So you think about the U.S. market as being the prize. Every country in the world, rich and poor, would like better access to the U.S. market. So when the United States government negotiates a free trade agreement, a so-called free trade agreement with another country, we get concession. We get them to agree to change their own domestic policies in ways they don't really want to, but they'll do to get the prize. And when the NAFTA battle was so interesting because we put together, and I'm actually really proud of the work that was done in the early 1990s around building a trinational coalition with Mexican, Canadian, and American labor, environmental, academic, human rights, development specialists, because we weren't going to fall into the trap of saying NAFTA is about, we're the United States, we don't like Mexico. Mexico's bad and the U.S. is good, and therefore we're going to fight NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. What we said is, sure, of course we want to trade with Mexico and Canada, but we want to trade on terms that are good for working people and good for the environment and good for consumers, and not just about multinational corporate profit, mobility, and flexibility. So it was a big, heavy lift, but it was, it set the groundwork for a different kind of globalization debate over many decades. And I would just say to you that over the course, so after I spent 20 years at the AFL-CIO, mostly doing the trade work, I testified before Congress, I traveled all over the world, I represented American workers in trade negotiations. I always would have told you that my career was one of failure. Like, we fought and we failed on NAFTA, on China permanent normal trade relations, on CAFTA, on fast track eventually. We won a couple times on fast track. But when I look back from where I am today, I would say no. And this is actually a message for young activists and academics out there, which is to say that it turns out we were making incremental progress. It was not steady. It was back and forth. There were wins, there were losses, there were setbacks, and so on. But as we made our arguments intellectually, but also politically, we built a coalition that could at least get close on a lot of these votes. And I think that's what was crucial, was that some of these votes happened in the middle of the night with people crying on the floor of the House of Representatives and losing their seat after they took a bad vote. But we worked in a bipartisan way, sometimes not that comfortably. But we did so, and each time we got close, and sometimes, for example, CAFTA, we held up for 2 years. They negotiated CAFTA. They couldn't bring it to the House of Representatives for 2 years because they did not have the votes, and that was the one that did pass in the middle of the night. But what they learned from that, and then on fast track in 1997, which is the enabling legislation that allows Congress to take an up or down vote on trade agreements, we beat fast track in 1997 and 1998. Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton had to pull it off the floor of the House of Representatives because they couldn't do it. And that meant they came to us, the Clinton administration, trade folks, to the AFL-CIO and said, what is it you want again? And I said, we want the core labor rights identified by the International Labor Organization. We want them written into the core text of the agreement, not a side agreement, and we want them to be enforceable by the same dispute settlement mechanisms that you have available for business concerns. And they kind of did it in Jordan. It was a little bit of a mess, but they did it. Then we built on it in Cambodia. We built on it, what's called the May 10th deal in 2006 with Peru, Colombia, South Korea, and Panama. And then we built on it again with the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement, the renegotiated NAFTA in 2019. And so that was the incremental progress. And now part of my job at the International Labor Affairs Bureau is to enforce the labor chapters in trade agreements. And it does create that opening where I have a reason to have a conversation with the labor ministers of Jordan or Colombia or Honduras or Bangladesh about labor rights. And this is, I think, one of the key pieces of what I want to talk about today. When we talk about organizing, I guess from my point of view, especially talking about globally, we talk about creating an enabling environment and removing obstacles for workers who want to organize. Let's just take as a given that workers who are working in horrible conditions should, and often do, want something better. They may not know how to go about doing that. They may not feel confident, have security, have physical security, have job security in doing it, but they want it. But the obstacles they face may be violence, murder, inadequate labor laws or unenforced labor laws, as Maggie was talking about, lack of democracy, so you can't even, vote out your leaders who are putting in place these terrible labor laws. If you live in an authoritarian or a monarchy, that's not going to be possible. And also lack of social protection, and I think that's also key. Like, we know that a worker going to the bargaining table, putting their neck out on the chopping block in order to organize a union takes huge risks. And if their livelihood and their survival and their family survival depends on it, and they have nothing else, they have no fallback, they don't have unemployment insurance or Social Security or assets, then it's going to be very difficult for them to do that. So those are all the many obstacles. But on the other side, there's also support. Like, what kinds of support can be useful? There can be resources made available, and that's another part of my job at iLab is we have a pretty significant technical assistance program that we do, almost $100 million a year if you include the USMCA plus, I think, maybe 40 or 50 countries around the world where we are putting in place projects that might, for example, create a worker center in Mexico or in Jordan that provides legal support or training for workers, that workers, certainly a lot of workers, first-generation union leaders might not know. What is a union? What is a collective bargaining agreement? What are my rights versus what are management's rights? What's legal and what isn't? And so those resources can be helpful. We also provide resources to governments, governments that are willing or say they're willing to improve their labor enforcement and inspection, for example. We can provide training for inspectors. We provide resources like electronic case management systems that can help inspectors with very scarce resources be more effective and strategic in targeting where to go. And also another example, in the USMCA, we've actually provided, Congress gave iLab $180 million to spend over 4 or 5 years to support the labor law reform, the 2019 labor law reform, which was very ambitious. And the point of the labor law reform was essentially to overturn a decades-long system of protecting corrupt unions and to replace it with independent democratic unions that workers could use their own personal, private, secret vote to choose a union of their choice. And so to support that, some of the kinds of projects we've done in Mexico have been helping the government to create a repository of collective bargaining agreements and union documents, because part of the problem was there were many, many workers in Mexico who were told, oh, you already have a union, you can't organize a union. They're like, I've never seen a union, I've never voted for a union. They say, oh yeah, you have a union, you have a collective bargaining agreement, you just don't know about it, it's secret. And so part of what this repository has done, and it's actually live right now, which is kind of amazing, is to take every collective bargaining agreement in the country and PDF it and put it up on a website so people can see not just what their collective bargaining agreement is, but also the guy across the street. And you can imagine how useful that is also for legal scholars and so on. But also, in Mexico, helping to stand up these new labor institutions, the Federal Labor Courts and the Labor Center for Conciliation and Union Registration. These are, I've been to Mexico now, I think 5 times since I took this job 2.5 years ago, and it's been extraordinary. I've visited these centers and watched them populate and the kinds of staff that they're putting in place, and workers in Mexico are winning. They are throwing out their protection unions. They are negotiating new collective bargaining agreements. They're getting significant wage increases, and there is a demonstration effect. And I think that's one of the things that the previous panelists talked about also. But I think another point that I wanted to make about this is about targeting the most vulnerable workers. And that is, I think, one of the most important things. What I see in my work, I think both Maggie and Jen maybe talked a little bit about it, migrant workers. When I travel all over the world, everywhere I go, the migrant workers are the ones who are isolated. They are mistreated, whether it's through legal, they're there illegally, so they have no legal status and they cannot go and complain when they're mistreated or underpaid or abused, or even if they're there legally, they don't really have the right to join a union or to form a union, either legally or just because the existing unions don't know how to deal with them. They don't speak the same language. They come and they go. They're temporary. And so those kinds of issues, I think, are the most interesting and most important. And I just want to talk about a couple of big projects that we have going at the Labor Department that are designed to help galvanize some of this exciting work that is happening right now. One is our MPower project, the Multilateral Partnership on Organizing Worker Empowerment and Rights. Great acronym, I didn't come up with it. But MPower is it's a multilateral initiative where we've brought together governments, unions, civil society, and philanthropy to basically, it's like a Friends of Freedom of Association and Collective Bargaining. Internationally, those countries that are most interested in doing that are doing a good job at home, and that also want to partner up internationally. So right now, our partners are Germany, Canada, Argentina, Spain, South Africa, Brazil, and France. And Mexico is about to join. But this is a way for us to sort of galvanize, and then for the non-government partners, the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, AFL-CIO, COSATU, the International Domestic Workers Federation, and a bunch of others are starting to pile in on that. But this is a way for us to come together both to find opportunities where something good is happening around the world and we want to support it, so especially for the donor countries, but then also to come together when there are attacks on workers, some often, unfortunately, violent attacks or even an attack on labor rights or labor legislation. But so the policy change, this is the point that I like best, because the question is, how do we motivate sustainable change? Both government and business. And those are the two players that have power here, that don't necessarily want to change because they like the global economy the way it is. And how do you change the power balance? And I think that's what both Maggie and Jen were also talking about, the power balance between workers and employers. And so for me, market access is a key piece of it. And this has been the the constant in my career is using trade policy, using access to the U.S. market as a way of motivating governments and companies to change. Because the governments, want to keep access partly on just optics. And the employers, the companies, the multinational corporations, they don't violate workers' rights for the fun of it. They violate workers' rights to make money and to sell the stuff in rich markets. They're not selling the stuff in Bangladesh or Cambodia or Honduras. They want mostly to sell stuff in the United States, in Europe, in Canada. So the wealthy markets, and especially if we can coordinate amongst ourselves, which is what we're starting to do a little bit more as part of my G7, G20 engagement, is to find other governments that want to coordinate how to do this and to use trade policy in an enforceable and consistent way. So the USMCA, but also the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is an incredibly powerful tool, and the Tariff Act of 1930, which has, you say, well, 1930, it's been around a long time, bans the import of goods made with forced labor, and yet it hadn't been enforced until 2016 or 2017 when an important loophole was closed. These are massively powerful tools that have corporate folks quaking in their boots because they have the possibility of losing access to the U.S. market instantaneously. A withhold release order from the Customs and Border Protection will stop their ability to sell goods into the United States. Or if they're found to be producing goods in Xinjiang, China, then there is a rebuttable presumption those goods are made with forced labor and those goods are not allowed to come into the United States. But the other piece, okay, I'm going to power through quickly because, of course, I've talked too much. But the enforceable brand agreements is another important tool, and I know Greg is going to talk about that. But the idea of starting from the top of the supply chain, where the power and the money is, the big brand names, the multinational corporations, they have the power to change what happens underneath them in the supply chain. They choose not to. They have what I call the willful ignorance or the convenient ignorance of not knowing, not having to know, not wanting to know what the hell is happening in their supply chain. Is there forced labor? Is there child labor? Are there violent violations of freedom of association and collective bargaining? So in all my career, in 30 years, I've had this conversation probably 1 million times with Nike, with others, where they're like, oh, I can't possibly be expected to know what's happening in my supply chain. It's just so hard. I have 2,000 subcontractors. They're all over the world. How would I know? And this is my job, to make them have to know and want to know. And to say to them, listen, you pay for it. You put your name on it. I hope you're doing some kind of quality control. If you wanted to know about the labor conditions in your supply chain, you absolutely could. And it's my job to make you care. And so that's the whole, the brand agreements, the enforceable brand agreements like the Bangladesh Accord, which is now the International Accord, it's expanded to Pakistan, the Lesotho Agreement that is happening with apparel companies, unions, and the government to address gender-based violence and harassment and safety and health at work, but also the Fair Food Project, which Greg, I hope, is going to talk about, to create supply chain accountability, transparency, and integrity, and to start where the money is and where the power is, because you can't actually start at the bottom. Like if you go to the fields where they're picking the cocoa or the tapping the rubber trees, there's too much poverty. There's not enough money there. You can just tell the kids to stay home. That's not going to work because you have to pay the farmers a decent price, and that's true at every single stage of the way. And the only way to make that happen is to make it economically uncomfortable, impossible for brands to continue to operate in ignorance without paying a decent price, without taking the trouble to know what kinds of labor conditions are happening. So let me finish by saying, in terms of research, the activist scholarship, I love, Maggie, what you were talking about, because I have often been either the economist in the labor movement or the labor person in the think tank or in the government. And I love having the bridge because I think it's really important, but I think a lot of the points you made about understanding the hierarchy of the organizations you're dealing with or the decision-making processes is very important, being respectful of that. But data is power, and the kind of work that EPI does and that academics do is invaluable to what we're doing. We are building out our research team and our research work We have something called a knowledge portal on iLab's website. Check it out. That takes basically the findings from all of our technical assistance projects over decades and encapsulates them in a nice, easily searchable database. But I really hope, and I know Mark Anner from Penn State in particular, I want to call out because he's been tremendous in helping us think through how do we define and measure worker voice and worker power. And some of the research he's done has been incredibly helpful to us in being able to make the argument we want to make when we're engaging with governments about the value of the high road versus the low road. And I'll give you one last anecdote, 2 seconds, which is I met with a labor minister of a country I'm not going to name, who was actually really interesting. And I'm like, listen, you've got a lot of problems here with enforcement and inspection. He said, I know, I don't have any resources, and I really want to strengthen our labor enforcement system. But the finance minister keeps telling me we can't because it's a job killer. And he wants to attract more foreign investment, and he wants to grow faster. And so this is the role of economics. And I hope we'll talk more about it in the next couple of days, which is that bad economics over the last couple of decades has dominated this space, where the finance ministers who probably got their PhD from Chicago 20 years ago and haven't read anything since then are still making the decisions. But I need to make room for that labor minister to win the argument with the finance minister when he says, if we enforce our labor laws, we protect workers, we are in compliance with international labor standards, we will succeed, prevail, and thrive in the global economy because governments and countries and activists are taking steps to make that so. Thank you.
This works? Yes? All right. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see all the smiling faces from last night and today. We're going to start with a video, which is a CNN video from a few years back. The only thing that's not perfect about this video in some ways is that it is from a few years back, so some of the amazing progress that's happened since the video came out is not included, but it is the most efficient and yet brutally powerful 4 minutes of television that I know of in terms of really conveying the problems, the exploitation that gave rise to the Fair Food Program and how the program is different and how it works from everything else. So just wanted to kick it off that way. And I would just add also, Maggie was very kind for her discretion, because when you mentioned our conversation, I'm pretty sure the other half was, and in Florida, 75 to 80% of the legislature is batshit crazy. So there's no chance we're going to have any kind of vote like that whatsoever. I'm sure those were the words. But anyway, thank you. And let's watch this video, and then we'll have a question. Patrick.
5:30 a.m. in Immokalee, Florida. It's a dark morning under an overcast sky as Alejandrina Carrera begins the 40-minute walk to her sister's house to drop off her 2 small children. It's too early for them to go to school, and they're too young to stay home alone. But Alejandrina has a bus to catch. Every day, hundreds of migrant farm workers, like Alejandrina, come to this parking lot in the center of town, where they board old school buses that take them to the fields. Alejandrina picks tomatoes on a farm about 30 minutes away. She likes her job now, says she's treated with respect. But it wasn't always that way. Alejandrina came to Immokalee from Mexico more than 20 years ago. She was alone, just 14 years old, small, scared, and extremely vulnerable. She says it didn't take long for someone to take advantage of her. It happened at one of the first farms she worked at. She says her boss promised her a better job in a warehouse. But as soon as she got in his truck, he drove to a remote part of the farm, and she knew she was in trouble.
Y el Señor me dice, si no haces por las buenas.
He told me if we don't do this the easy way, we'll do it the hard way. I was afraid and trembling. He tried to abuse me sexually, but he didn't get to because another worker heard me screaming and came to help me. The next day, the boss fired us both.
Agricultural workers are without a doubt the most vulnerable workers in the United States, and I would say across the world.
John S. Forms is co-owner of Sunripe Certified Brands, where Alejandrina works today.
Let's talk about reality here. This is farming. This is agriculture. Agriculture has, from the very early days of man farming and needing to have work, has been full of opportunities for abuse.
His family-owned farm is one of the largest in the U.S. and was the first to join the Fair Food Program, an innovative initiative that has been held up as the most comprehensive social responsibility program in U.S. agriculture. Today, nearly every farm in Florida has signed on. The program combines a set of high standards that includes monitoring the farms and educating the workers.
Buenos días.
Leonel Perez works for the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, or CIW, a nonprofit organization that developed the Fair Food Program. Today, CIW is holding a training session with farm workers, teaching them not only what rights they have, but what to do when those rights are violated. Leonel and the other educators here have first-hand knowledge because they are all former migrant farm workers themselves.
Y lo más importante.
The most important thing for me is to be able to talk to other workers because I have a shared experience. I work in the fields too, and now we can work together to end worker abuse.
The Fair Food Program works because it has market consequences. If a farm violates the code of conduct, it is suspended from the program and cannot sell to participating buyers, which includes some of the biggest fast food restaurants and grocery stores. It all makes a big difference for those at the bottom of the supply chain, like Alejandrina.
Voy a trabajar libremente.
You can work freely. You're not going to be harassed. You're not going to be insulted. You're not going to be forced to work. There's more respect now.
These days, Alejandrina wakes up in the morning happy to come to work, proud to talk to her kids about the company she works for. And that, she says, is the biggest change of all. Amara Walker, CNN.
Okay. Very interesting. Little film. All right. So the next presentation will be with Greg Asbed with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. We're going to do this a little bit different than the others. More of a question and answer format with Greg, and then also we'll transition to a question and answer with the audience. So picking up on that clip from CNN, what was it like in the field in the early 1990s when Coalition of Immokalee Workers, so slightly before it came online, the Fair Food Program, what was going on?
Lupe, of course, made a wonderful job of explaining, describing the conditions yesterday, and you did too, in your presentation. I had in the early 1990s, I had a slightly different perspective in the sense that the CIW had not yet begun to organize, and I was working with a group called the Florida Rural Legal Services Corp, I guess is their official name. But it's legal services for farm workers. That's a way to help people who don't have money try to use the legal system to protect themselves. And so from 91 to 95, I was actually working with them before the CIW became an official organization in 95, after getting kicked out of the church where we were organizing for the first big strike that we did. But where Florida Legal Services was not a particularly effective way of making change, it was a great place to actually see exactly what was happening for workers in the fields, because it was pretty much the only show in town in Immokalee. And if somebody was beaten, if somebody was ripped off, if somebody was being held against their will, you had to go to that office to talk to me or a couple other people there to see what could be done. So I had people walk into my office from 91 on who came in bloodied from the field because they had tried to get paid for a bucket that they had thrown up to the truck, which you saw in this video, right? So you have to overfill, in the early days, you have to overfill a bucket way over top, because that was a way of stealing money from me, because you get paid per bucket. So every 10 buckets you pick, you've picked an extra bucket for free, right? And so if it wasn't high enough, if it wasn't cupped enough, the bucket would come back and hit you in the face if the guy was of that humor in the morning. And so people would come back with broken noses, and then, some people would just come back with that broken nose, or they'd come back worse because they decided to defend themselves afterwards, and they'd pull a tomato stake out of the ground and a fight would ensue. And so that would happen. People would come in with that sort of thing. People, obviously, all the time, it was a constant, was systemic wage theft of all kinds. Whether it was simply not paying the check, or if it was faking minimum wage, faking hours in order to systemically not pay minimum wage to entire crews. Women, of course, as Lupe described, women faced incredibly difficult conditions with nowhere to turn. And then, just to give you one brief example, our work as the CIW started to organize in 1993, there was more and more of a community base to the investigation process. And some people from the CIW, and I and Laura Germino, who today heads up our anti-forced labor work, learned about a very large underground modern-day slavery operation, Miguel Flores. And we learned about it from people in Immokalee, but they were up in South Carolina working at the time. So we went up to South Carolina, a group of us, to talk to workers on a farm. And some workers came up to us and said, "Hey, can you help us get our last check? Because we didn't get paid," right? And we said, "Sure, what happened?" They said, "Well, we had to take off in the middle of the night from the labor camp where we were working." I was like, "Why was that?" "Because the police came." "Why did the police come?" "Because our boss had shot one of our friends in the stomach, and I think our friend is dead." And they said, "Well," and we said, "Why was he shot in the stomach?" And he said, "Because he was telling us that we don't have to act, we don't have to be, we don't have to work like slaves in this country. But we're free to move from one boss to another if we want to." And the boss killed him in front of everybody to make a point. So when the police came, we took our chance and we took off, right? That's how information would come to us, of the kinds of absolutely outrageous, hair, spine tingling exploitation that took place. And it was normal before the Fair Food Program. So that's what gave birth to it. But the other thing that gave birth to the Fair Food Program was not just the conditions, because as you know, those existed forever. I mean, those were the conditions in farms. In the early 1990s, and this is important, in 1993, Father Bertrand Aristide, Jean-Bertrand Aristide in Haiti was overthrown. He had been elected president, a popular figure, elected president, overthrown by the government. Everybody who supported Aristide in Haiti was now persona non grata in Haiti, and they came in a refugee wave to the U.S., and in particular to Immokalee. Some of those people had incredible professional history of organizing as what they call animators in Haiti, with the ability, with training in centers, in peasant movements, that I was actually myself fortunate enough to get training in as well during 3 years of my life in Haiti. And so when people that I actually worked with in Haiti showed up into Immokalee as refugees working in the fields, they had this technology of social change that had never been used in this country before. It's popular education, bottom-up development change model that we all decided to work together with. And it wasn't just people from Haiti. It was people from Guatemala who had worked in cooperatives. And if you remember 1993 in Mexico, in Chiapas, there was some stuff going on there too. And so 93, 94 was an incredibly fertile time in Immokalee, underground, under radar, nobody knew about it, of people who came to pick fruit, but who had this remarkable technology for social change that they brought in their suitcases, and that we all decided to actually put to work. So it was both the conditions and the opportunity to change them that in the 1990s happened in Immokalee.
Okay. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the labor camp in South Carolina.
Manning, South Carolina.
The agricultural workers in Florida picked the peaches in South Carolina. They worked in a labor camp, picked the apples in Poughkeepsie, New York, picked the cherries in Western Michigan. And labor camp was sort of like a site of lawlessness and exploitation, and it's really horrible.
Isolated and completely under the control of the people who run them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the contractors, bosses run them, and the workers are viciously exploited.
Yeah.
I spent time on the labor camp.
Yeah, I can tell.
Okay. So, what does CIW do? I mean, what's the first thing you tried to make things better to get past these horrible work?
So the first thing we tried to do is do what this model of organizing does, which is to build consciousness. Right? It's not one based on just sort of organizing to get a new street light or that sort of thing like you see in the United States. It's around building awareness, a critical awareness of the problems that the community is facing. So in this case, it was what makes farm workers poor, right? Why are farm workers vulnerable to that kind of abuse? Why? Why is that happening? And to do that, you need to have sort of a practice of thoughtful conversation, thoughtful reflection in the group, you know? So we created that space to do that, working with a Catholic church in town. And so we had a couple of years, really, of just, weekly gatherings with people who wanted to ask those questions and to delve into what possible solutions there might be. So we built that, and we built. In fact, the motto of the CIW is pretty simple. It's C plus C equals C, as Lupe knows. And while it's not mathematically correct, it is absolutely socially correct, because it's consciousness plus commitment equals change, right? And consciousness is the first factor in change, right? And then the commitment comes from that consciousness, because without that deep understanding of the world that you're caught in and the world that you're trying to change, it's almost impossible to change. So that was the process we started with, and from there we became sort of I like to think of it, because it's pretty much the only thing you could think of it, is late 20th century IWW. If people are familiar with the IWW, the Wobblies as an organization, that's sort of what we were. We had just sort of wildcat strikes. We had several of them in the 1990s that were huge and that occupied the central parking lot in Immokalee, if you know, where people get picked up in the morning in buses and dropped off in the afternoon. 5-day-long massive strikes with buses rushed out, bosses rushed out, people taking over. We had the 30-day hunger strike by 6 of our members that Lupe mentioned yesterday, which is a remarkable thing when you think about it. We did a 240-mile march from Fort Myers to Orlando to go to the center, the headquarters of the farm, the organization that runs the farms in Florida. It wasn't. Those were all powerful actions, and we did make change. Right? We did manage to, for example, fight back an initial wage cut that went below minimum wage. We stopped that, got the wage cut rescinded. We managed to actually raise wages by the bucket rate by about 25%, from 40 to 50%, 50 cents. I'm sorry. And we found and exposed and brought to justice a number of forced labor cases. But we didn't feel that what we were looking for, we were getting, because what we were looking for was to have a real voice, a sustained place at the table, where decisions are made about that change people's lives as workers.
So, give us a little more detail about the relationship between the Fair Food Program, worker-driven social responsibility, and the working with the different restaurants, with Taco Bell, the others.
Right. Okay. Since
And also, like, what are the components of the Fair Food Program? Those that's mentioned a lot.
Yeah.
People may not actually know.
So I got the 5-minute flash already. So I'm gonna leave the components to Judge Laura, who's gonna speak later. And you're gonna talk about those, right? Okay, yeah. And I'll just talk about CSR versus WSR, right? Because that goes to the relationships with the companies. So everybody here is familiar with CSR, corporate social responsibility, and the social audit led model of I don't know, public relations. You know, it has nothing to do with workers' rights. It has nothing to do with human rights. It's just this model for public relations by other means. CSR was created about 30 years ago through pressure from consumers about conditions in sweatshops. That's where it kind of was born in that fight. And corporations started to come out with these codes of conduct. And at that same time is exactly when we started to actually reconsider our situation and why. What is it that makes is it farms that make farm workers poor, or is there some other power? And we realized that power is actually much bigger than the farmer, way beyond the farm gate and in the food industry as a whole at the top of these retail brands. So these brands, as we came to see that, also had these codes of conduct. And it reminds me of Gandhi's, maybe apocryphal, but I'm not sure, but Gandhi's quote when asked about, like, what do you think about British civilization? And I think the answer was, it would be a great idea. And if someone had asked us, what do you think about codes of conduct? Our answer would have been, they'd be a great idea if they were real, if they meant anything. People who buy products produced by poor people in bad conditions should be responsible for those conditions and help the people get out of those because they're profiting from that labor, right? That's a great idea. And so what we set about doing was trying to make that idea real, right? And WSR is sort of the polar opposite of CSR in every way. And rather than being made by and for corporations, it's made by and for workers. Rather than being controlled by corporations, it's controlled by workers. Rather than being something created with the end of convincing consumer that everything is cool here, don't bother us anymore, look over there, right? It's something actually created to stop the problems that are happening on the ground, to stop the human rights violations from happening. And that's because the people who are suffering those human rights violations are the ones who wrote and created and monitor and control the process. So if you yourself are being sexually harassed at work every day, will you be interested in something that actually doesn't ever stop the sexual harassment, but does tell consumers that it stopped? But if you ran the company that the consumers are bugging, that's all you'd want to achieve, and that's what they achieve. WSR is the opposite. WSR actually sets out to and has a wonderful track record for the past 12 years of doing that. So just to set that track record clear, in 2001, we launched the Taco Bell boycott and the campaign for fair food. 2001. The concept there, that Taco Bell should pay a penny more per pound to help improve wages of the workers at the bottom of its supply chain directly to those workers, and only buy from growers who protect workers' rights and who demonstrably protect workers' rights. That concept is the core concept, those two concepts of WSR. That was in 2001. We fought for 4 years. In 2005, we won the first, what some people call enforceable brand agreements. We called the Fair Food Agreement in 2005. That first agreement established all the key elements of what became WSR, all of them, from a code that was informed by workers' experience to a regular payment to improve wages from Taco Bell to workers, and most importantly, a complaint process backed by market consequences. Right? All those elements were established in an agreement between workers at the bottom of the supply chain and the corporation at the very top. A legally binding agreement that established all those elements. 2005 to 2010, we achieved, I think, 8 more agreements like that from McDonald's to others, right? Until we had enough market power, as Lupe said yesterday, enough market power in 2010 to break the growers' boycott, because the growers were not at all interested in participating in our vision of a more just, more humane agricultural industry. But as we had just heard in Thea's presentation, access to the market is everything. If you sell things for money, for profit, What do you got? You got to go to the market to sell them. So if you don't have access to that market, you don't have anything. And what we essentially did was create that exact dynamic by denying access to the companies that signed these agreements with us for the growers who won't participate in the program. So in 2011, we were able to launch the first fully functional WSR program, the Fair Food Program, and probably the next card I see is 0 minutes. Therefore, I will stop, and Judge Laura will take over from there in terms of talking about what's happened in those past 12 years and where we are in the future, or questions and answers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, each one of you, our panelists. Very informative presentation. So we will move now to, I guess, question and answers with the audience and with people also online. So open up the floor. Got one online? Okay, let's take one online.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Lenore Palladino. I'm an assistant professor of economics and public policy here at UMass, and I'm so grateful for everyone who's come here to be part of this conference. And I learned so much from all the presentations and have many, many follow-up questions for all of you. But I wanted to actually ask really all of you, and I think, Jen, you brought this up, if I remember correctly. I'm just curious how, for those of us who have been in workers' rights and labor rights movements for a long time, we're very aware of the current wave of union organizing that's been happening. But I'm just curious, for example, you talked about energy that's building in right-to-work states to repeal right-to-work laws or to embed more rights in collective bargaining, in public sector collective bargaining agreements. How has this current moment of, from Starbucks to Amazon to Hollywood to now the UAW, how has that changed conditions on the ground? So maybe both in terms of formal union organizing in more red or sort of more challenging places, and then also I'd be curious about how that's changing, what is the sort of impact or relationship that that's having with migrant worker organizing around the country as well?
So I think you, okay. You name-checked some of the really important breakthroughs, and I think I didn't bring a map of the successful Starbucks unionization efforts, but the geography of that, right, has been so important because part of my window on this is, I have the bird's eye view of what are our 60 network groups around the country doing, and really I'm in close touch with probably 20 of them more routinely because they're very deeply into the worker power work. But I can't tell you how many times in the last 2 years somebody who is a researcher or a policy analyst at one of our groups says, I have learned so much because my friend down the street is now a Starbucks Workers United member, right? Because that's happening in so many states, it has been a generational shift, I think, in people, even people who aren't directly involved are being touched by that. This is anecdotal, right? So I'll give you the EPI official answer also, which is, we are monitoring the increase in strike activity, the things that are measurable so far. The uptick in union petitions to the NLRB, which continue to steadily creep upward, the uptick in win rates in those petitions for new unions. We are not, of course, and lots of charts on the EPI website will confirm this, we are not approaching anywhere like the level of strike activity of even the 1970s or the 1980s, right? But the trend line is important and signals, a moment of opening. And I think the geography of the strikes as well, we talk about the geography of organizing, but the way in which the stand-up strike distributed that activity across multiple states with very different, in many cases, political geographies. If folks are curious about, just sort of thinking about this, the dynamic of the way that public officials responded to the strike in Kentucky, for example, I think is super interesting and fascinating, where they have a Democratic governor but a very Republican legislature. And the Democratic governor, came out forcefully and publicly as a real ally of UAW members. This is a different moment, and I would also say, in terms of state policy and the room to open up a focus on strengthening union rights at the state level, the more important shift in some ways has been the active leadership of certain progressive Democrats, which we didn't have 10 years ago, 15 years ago, right? So that has also been game changing, and it's being driven by their understanding of how important this is to their constituents, of course. And even though we're not, overnight seeing doubling of union density, that's going to take time. Right? All of the obstacles, as all of you in this room know, right? I mean, all of the obstacles to getting from a union to a first contract are still there. We haven't talked about that today. But I mean, I love the fact that we're, hearing so many examples of workers who face not only those obstacles, but, no legal clear support either. So that's a reminder that all of this is possible. And it's becoming more possible in this moment than it's certainly been any other time in my lifetime. So somebody else should address the part of the question that was about migrant workers, though. Oh, we have questions.
Let me just say one quick thing about that, which is not so much about in the U.S., but just to say the importance of the critical mass, the momentum, the spark, and the demonstration effect, which we see internationally. And it's, I think, the opposite of that is the death spiral, or the situation, which I think we were in the United States, where unions are weak, they get weaker, they can't impact labor law, they can't demonstrate that there's a value to a union because nobody looks around and sees that anybody they know has a union that has delivered anything valuable. So I think it's just an exciting and an interesting moment, but you can't underplay the impact that a few successes create some of that energy, the opening, the possibility. And also just one quick thing about globally, you do see the European Union moving forward with their mandatory due diligence, which is not perfect by any means, but it is a signal to companies. We're starting to look down your supply chain, and the UK and France and Germany with modern slavery legislation. Canada and Mexico both banned the import of goods made with forced labor. That was a USMCA provision, and we've been in conversation with them about how best to do that. But so, at least having the conversation, I think, is a really exciting possibility, but it's up to us then to turn it into something real.
Any questions?
That was fantastic. Thank you to all of you. Okay. Yeah, I'm Janice Fine. I run the Workplace Justice Lab, and I'm a professor at Rutgers University. Thea, I had a question for you, which is a few years ago, I wrote a bunch of papers for the Solidarity Center on migrant workers and how their unions in the countries in which they were working related to them. And it wasn't a pretty picture. I did Jordan, the DR, Sri Lanka, and South Africa, and I spent I spent a long time in South Africa trying to spend time with COSATU and with farm workers unions and others, understanding what their attitudes was. And the puzzle was sort of like, how can a revolutionary labor movement that was so critical to abolishing apartheid be so bad on migration and on migrant rights? I'm curious about, I know you talked about migrant workers all over the world, and at iLab, how you're thinking about it, and I'm wondering about, are you seeing progress in this particular area? And a question for Greg that may be, and Maggie, that may be actually for Judge Laura, my favorite judge, is how are you using DALE? Are you using the new H-2A? Well, they're not in place yet, but the new H-2A regs, and also the protected concerted activity stuff that the NLRB's been doing. It has been a different day the last few years with the Biden administration. So I'm curious about how this has impacted farm worker stuff.
Thank you for the question, Janice. Unfortunately, I think there's more challenges than success stories in this world. And some of the countries that you mentioned, I've been to, and I've pulled my hair out over the conversations, because some of these unions are, long established. They're very comfortable, and they're not really interested or able, for whatever reason, whatever discrimination and biases exist in the society tend to exist also in the unions. I'd say maybe Brazil, I see more of a spark. And the U.S. and Brazil, President Biden and President Lula just launched our Partnership for Workers' Rights, a global initiative. And I think the Brazilian unions have always been very forward-leaning. They're doing a lot to reach out to gig and platform economy workers, some of whom are migrant or Afro-descendant, workers who tend to be more marginalized. And so I love to see, big, strong unions like the Brazilian unions understanding that their survival and their success is going to depend on whether they can, in fact, connect. And we see a little bit in Africa, too, in terms of some of the, not so much South Africa. I think, we're still also in good conversations with them to see what can happen next. But I'm afraid it's still very difficult. I wish I had a better story to tell.
Just briefly on that, one of the wonderful things about the program is that 90% of its code is follow the law. So anytime there's new law, new regulations, it becomes part of the code. And anytime that those laws are particularly favorable, they become a very important point of emphasis in the new season. So yes, we do. Another thing, just briefly on what this administration is doing, the USDA, I don't know if you saw the USDA regulations on the new expansion of the H-2A program to Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Which obviously has, immigration battle reasons behind it. But what they did, much to their credit, was to say that if a farm they set different levels of subsidies, and the highest, which is called the platinum level of subsidy, is fairly significant. They said if a farm has a collective bargaining agreement or neutrality agreement, or is part of a WSR program, then they get the highest level of subsidy. And phones have been ringing off the hook since then, because money, is kind of an attractive incentive. Administrations matter, obviously, right? And so this administration has been doing some good stuff on the margins for farm workers, definitely.
So do we have anybody? Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Jim Stanford, Center for Future Work in Vancouver. My question is for Jen. One of the ways we can strengthen this bridge between researchers and organizers that we're talking about is through engaging researchers in popular education work in terms of training activists in communities that we're working in. So your idea of Unions 101 caught my attention. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you've organized the course, resourced the course. What are the resources, curriculum, and so on that you use? Who do you get to teach these in all of those different 60 locations? And then how do you kind of embed it in those communities rather than it having to be an expert who flies in from the EPI? I'd love to hear more about that.
Okay, you're on to me. I am both not an economist and not an attorney. I am actually a popular educator. My background is mainly in labor education, and I worked on, I was at a labor center at a university for many, many years before I came to EPI. So the Unions 101 idea, I think Thea and others, had long envisioned this as a new function for EPI to be playing, and particularly in support of our state network. I would say that what you just articulated is sort of stage 2, 3, and 4. We're only in stage 1, which so far has mainly meant, oftentimes on Zoom, that we are convening and I'm facilitating or co-facilitating in some cases with our, when we do state-specific versions, the curriculum and the discussion, and just sort of, drawing on my long labor education background and marrying a lot of EPI data and resources to a framework that has people think through their own experiences. And, the audiences shift a little bit, we are not to phase 2, 3, and 4, which is exactly with what we hope future capacity we can move to. The other thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about is how we collaborate with partners in people's states, because here we are in Massachusetts, where there is incredible popular education capacity embedded in universities and in some cases, nonprofits and grassroots groups. And it is not realistic in many cases for our research and policy teams, which are, tiny and have, fairly dedicated skill sets, to probably replicate that. But they can be partnering with other groups that have that expertise and sort of bringing the research and the popular education. Now, we also have folks working in states where there isn't that capacity. And so it's a lot tougher to figure out how to. But anyway, I love that question. Would love to talk about it more. I won't talk about it more now because I know we got a ton of questions. But that is a longer term vision that we'd love to build out further. And
I like that question too, and I just want to, so going back to the sort of examples, there have been some statewide meetings that TAO has done with farm workers, and one of the questions is how to get them more engaged. And then I'm part of the conversation, the follow-up conversation, and I'm like, popular education, you could be doing this, or you could do this sort of thing, or they're playing in groups and blah. And then I get asked, great, Maggie, can you help design the next statewide 7-hour meeting? So I think this is a place where, an activist academic can play a role if you have a background at all in popular education. And in that case, it was really a lot of Zoom meetings to train the organizers, the union organizers, for how to do this. And of course, the big thing was keep your mouth shut, right? Like, you really have to step back and let the groups do this work. But I really appreciate that question as well. Thanks.
Okay, we have one question from the Zoom participants. Do the stipulated conditions aimed at enhancing labor and environmental standards in partner countries within the framework of free trade agreements align with the pricing expectations and willingness of the U.S. to pay for commodities that adhere to these upgraded standards?
Okay, great question. The labor rights that are embedded in trade agreements generally are two categories. One is compliance with the International Labor Organization core workers' rights, that is freedom of association, collective bargaining, freedom from discrimination, child labor, forced labor, and since last year, the right to a safe and healthy workplace. So those are the core labor rights that most of these countries are already committed to by virtue of their membership in the ILO. So we're taking the international consensus from a UN tripartite body, and then we add to it complying with countries' own domestic labor laws. So in our view, what we're saying here is that, first of all, these are workers' human rights that we're asking people to comply with, versus, and then also to enforce their own labor laws, and that they might lose access to international markets if they are not in those compliance. The question is a really good one about pricing expectations, and that is, I think, one of the reasons for these enforceable brand agreements, and when I said starting at the top, which is to ensure that these multinational corporations are not squeezing the folks at the bottom. And I think that's something that is harder to do. The market access and the trade agreements is about bare compliance. That is just saying there shouldn't be slavery, there shouldn't be kids, there shouldn't be workers who try to organize a union shouldn't be shot in the head and left by the side of the road. That's bad. And you should be enforcing the laws that you have on the books. But the next piece, which is to get to a place where, especially these big international markets, whether it's the green energy supply chain, solar panels and electric vehicle batteries, cocoa, clothing, sugar, coffee, palm oil, all of those things where there's money at the top and yet it doesn't trickle down. I think that has to happen from the kind of agreement that Greg is talking about with the Fair Food Coalition, the enforceable brand agreements, where the brands have to take responsibility for paying a price which allows people to live like human beings. And they haven't done that yet. That takes a lot more pressure.
it's interesting. It's clear in the world and so when you say social responsibility, I want to fall asleep when I say those words, right? But like WSR is named worker-driven social responsibility, but it's because it is a relationship that deals with a part of the economy, the most important part, which is that top part, in some ways, that speaks in those terms. So you put it in those terms to draw the distinction between W for workers and C for corporate, right? But it's really about enforcement. It's really worker-driven human rights enforcement, right? And what's becoming clear, so CSR has had 30 years to prove its mettle, right? And it's failed miserably. I mean, miserably. It couldn't be more of a failure, right? And what's interesting is there is a paradigm shift happening in the world of business and human rights. It's underway. We were in Geneva a year ago at the Business and Human Rights Annual Forum. And the overarching theme of the forum was centering workers in the monitoring and protection of their own rights. And we had been there several years before that, and that idea was not even understood at the time. So there is a paradigm shift happening. But it will not be immediate. It just won't be immediate. It'll be gradual because infrastructure that exists to serve the old model. There's an $80 billion auditing industry out there in the world that serves these corporations to do $80 billion industry that's out there that does this. And then that's not counting in each corporation itself how much money they put to having these completely ridiculously unempowered offices of people who do social responsibility in those corporations, right? So all of that is infrastructure. It's like if you're trying to switch from the gasoline-powered car to the electric car. You have infrastructural issues that will take time, but it is inevitable because the failure of CSR, just the simple idea, and I'll stop on this, but so this town is a beautiful, bucolic little place. Say suddenly there's a wave of car theft and home invasion and all kinds of things that the populace here gets up in arms about and demands that the local politicians do something to stop, right? And they say, oh, don't worry. We're going to bring an auditing firm in once every couple of years for a day in order to get a handle on this thing, right? Are you going to even begin to feel that that's an answer that you would even conceivably accept? No, not at all. So what you need, unfortunately, is enforcement. You need law enforcement, right? And that is the difference between CSR and WSR. WSR is 24/7, worker-driven, workers as frontline monitors of their own rights, empowered by binding legal agreements with the purchasing power of the buyers behind them. That's a police force made of workers. Yeah, stopping human rights violations. That does not exist in CSR. So that simple logic will eventually tumble CSR, but it's not going to fall immediately.
Thank you, Greg. That's great. I wanted to say one more thing, which is about money and about pricing, which is the prices of these goods are big enough to pay for the workers to have a decent life, but there's like a 50% retail markup, and there's a lot of money spent on advertising and the CEO pay. There's so much fat in those budgets, and so that's why the market access, the economic consequences, making the CEO care about what happens down the supply chain. They could double, triple, quadruple the price that the workers in the field get without even noticing it. They might have to raise the price a penny. They might have to, make some adjustments. But mostly they'd have to spend less money on wasteful shit like useless social audits and other things like that. So that's, just to say there's enough money there.
Oh. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I know we're running out of time. As short as I can, but it was a really long question, but I will try and reduce it. I'm Jayati Ghosh. Thank you. This was a fascinating session and really very interesting. I'm at PERI here. This is also to Thea, actually. So I'm trying to just put a little bit of complexity into this. Why do so many people and trade unions and workers in the developing world see this as protectionist? They're not stupid. It's not only governments and the rich guys there who are trying to oppress the workers. It's also workers who see this as protectionist. And it's because the basic reality in most developing countries is of huge informality of work, right? In India, 90% of workers are informal, no legal or social rights or protection of any kind. In many, on average, it's 70% of the developing world's workers are informal. you take a tiny sliver of them and you say, we're going to enforce proper labor standards there, and otherwise we are withdrawing market access, which means you will not be allowed to export. And that will reduce your employment and economic activity. I take everything you said, I completely agree. I mean, obviously we all want better conditions for our workers. Does it always play out that way? No, it doesn't. So the thing is that what workers in a lot of these countries see is, yes, there are these conditions which are being put on minimal workers' rights, labor standards for the trade agreement, but that trade agreement is also coming with extremely onerous intellectual property rights, rules on investment, market access for the US and the EU, etc., all of which undermine employment, living standards, and economic activity in these countries. So it's a more complex question. You have to go beyond just those little companies that you deal with. It's a bigger issue of how countries develop, what employment generation would look like, and whether you can ensure that while insisting that, okay, the few companies that I deal with are going to be good boys.
Well, I'll stipulate that we will answer that longer question in a different place. But just to say one thing is that a lot of the workers who have been beneficiaries of some of these changes in Central America and Mexico and Swaziland don't see it as protectionist. They see it as the only way to have the external intervention of somebody saying to their government, enough already. Like you can't have an investment strategy which revolves on offering up cheap disempowered workers who work under terrible conditions. And so it's a way of changing something. It's not perfect, and you're absolutely right. Most of these are embedded in trade agreements that are problematic in other ways.